It's the content machine. Unlimited content works. I can't be stopped. Look, this time around we got SIGURD, who is the Norse counterpart to the servant Siegfried. Let's get it. In Lost Belt 2, we saw him tear through the divine shields around the Palace of Fire and tear through Brynhilder's armor in order to get to her. He is one of the only 3 servants that was strong enough to amputate Surtur's arm. He did this with the help of Napoleon and Brynhilder. From the way that he does battle, we see that he's capable of punching swords as if they're bullets. He has knowledge about rune magecraft from Brynhilder. This extends to even primordial runes, some of the strongest spells in the verse. He has runes that allow him to transform his body and reform his appearance. Similar to Bazette, he has revival runes that allowed him to bring Brynhilder back to life. He can use his runes to strengthen his defense if necessary. We saw him use this against Surtur alongside Heracles and Scotty. By combining the materials that he got from Da Vinci and one of his primordial runes, he was able to create enhanced glasses for the main character. These go as far as reducing visual strain and negating damage from beasts that aren't strong enough. He has a higher than average intelligence, being able to outsmart the spirit Ishtar. This was without the help of his wisdom runes, which would make him even smarter. We've seen him perform as a high level tactician, being able to destroy mysterious heroine's spirit core and she didn't even notice. His awareness is higher than average. We saw that he could sense mysterious being in Excalibur Wielder on his intuition alone. He had the capacity and the skill to reforge the demonic sword Gram. He has a telekinetic power that returns his sword back to his hand in a similar fashion to Ku with Gabol. We saw him deflect a great amount of fire from the giant Surtur while he was injured. He managed to damage Surtur with the help of Ophelia's command spell. In the servant verse, we saw with the help of Calamity Jane, he was able to take down a primordial goddess. Because of his background in Lost Belt 2 specifically, he is half Surtur and half SIGURD due to having his summoning hijacked. From the conversations with Gordolf, we know that he stopped the Shadow Border from entering Zero Cell, which basically means that he straight up negated its ability to hop dimensions. To our surprise, he was able to pick up and toss the entire Shadow Border as if it was a piece of paper. This is a ridiculous feat on its own because the Shadow Border is like 2 tanks combined in terms of size. That's equivalent to him casually tossing 120 tons. During the Lost Belt, we saw him casually overwhelming MASH just using the powers of his short sword alone. He was phasing straight through the Shadow Border's defense system, which not only has physical defense, but it also has several magical barriers that are Age of Gods level. It was so bad to the point where Da Vinci and Sherlock Holmes were in shock that he was even able to pull this off. You have the feat that he performed against Sherlock, straight up chopping off his entire arm. We had Ophelia tell us that he's the 2nd strongest in the entire Lost Belt right after Scotty. He tanked an attack that came from a reinforced MASH with no problem. In that same situation with Sherlock, we found that he put a death rune on his body when he cut his arm off. He has access to numerous amounts of primordial runes that are Age of Gods level, the death rune being one of them. As long as you have flesh and blood, your fate is sealed. Spirits, on the other hand, have a little more leg room. You have the time where Ophelia was complimenting SIGURD, saying that he's the strongest knight to ever live. He has an uncredited skill in presence concealment, being able to sneak up behind the Shadow Border without being noticed until the last second. The story tells us that his energy is on the same level as the steam engine back in London, which took an entire Holy Grail just to power. Again, with them being counterparts, we know that he's at least on par with the servant Siegfried. You had the fact that Da Vinci mentioned that his energy is up there with Ivan the Terrible, who was literally a Lost Belt king. You had Napoleon mention how he hits harder than the giants that you find in the Lost Belt. He has multiple stages where he can bring out even more power when they're released by Ophelia. He straight up tanked 2 Phantasm phantasms from Napoleon and mocked him for it. He didn't even take him serious. He took on blows from Canis, who is also a top tier servant. From Mash, we know that we can detect his energy through Scotty's castle, which normally shouldn't even be possible. We had her mention without his limitations that his power is unlike anything she's ever seen. He took Brynhilde's phantasm straight to the chest, still no damage. This had everybody shook. He's been shown having the ability to create fire without even using his runes. Based on the interactions with Napoleon, he had to admit that Sigurd's speed was outright overwhelming him. He straight up negated Ophelia's Mystic Eye, this same Mystic Eye being the highest level that you can have. We know that Sigurd has shown the fortitude to resist Suitor, which is impressive in its own right considering how strong Suitor actually is. Now, for the sake of everything coming full circle, we're gonna get into some feats from Suitor, who was half the reason why Sigurd was that busted in the first place. He is one of the strongest beings out there. He is the fire giant from Norse mythology who is literally destined to bring an end to the world. He tells us that he was able to hijack Sigurd's summoning just by anchoring himself through Ophelia's Mystic Eye. Sherlock mentions how his entire being is like the sun itself, his body being the realm of fire incarnated. The sheer magnitude of his power is so ridiculous that he can summon a sword that heats up to over 4 million degrees Celsius in magical energy alone. Upon his true summoning, he physically climbed out of the false sun that was located in the Lost Belt. From the conversations with Scotty, we know that he can regenerate in just 2 minutes after taking a phantasm straight from Napoleon. Mind you that this phantasm was an overcharge and it took Napoleon sacrificing his life to do it. Ophelia mentions that even if you manage to blow his head off, that is something that will come back as well. The story tells us that in his background, Suitor's might was enough to absorb Fenrir, take down the gods, and destroy the 9 realms of Asgard. This doesn't even include the fact of him trying to burn down the entire planet. Just to further put this into perspective, it took Odin, the All-Father Odin, collaborating with other gods just to bring Suitor to a stalemate. They couldn't even beat him. He had to be sealed away. This is who was sharing a body with Sigurd. You had Mash mention that he has too much magical energy for the shadow border to identify. You had Ophelia mention that his magical energy alone was jamming her signal. You had Da Vinci bring up that just blocking his attack makes it feel like you're being submerged in lava. Sherlock tells us that he's nearly hot as a star. Da Vinci says that the only reason we weren't being incinerated alive is because of all the snow and ice infused with magical energy. It tells us that every time he moved, something shattered, the mountains crumbled, the seas evaporated. It gets crucial. When he got injured in his past, his blood turned into flames. So harming him harms you too. On top of having access to Fenrir's power, he started to sprout out the wings of Fafnir on his back. He can alter his size depending on the way that he's being observed. Again, Da Vinci mentions that conceptually, he is a calamity that can destroy the world. In this case, that will be the entire Lost Belt. He's shown having access to a unique dragon spell that allowed him to meld part of Ophelia's soul with his. Using this, he can hold back the person's soul and their mind. We've seen him completely shatter all the masks that Scotty used to control the giants throughout the Lost Belt. Not only that, but he took control of these same giants right after. His magecraft gives him the ability to communicate telepathically. His 4 million degree phantasm is a divine construct that's born from the planet, similar to Excalibur. Sherlock further mentions that not even a deity from the Age of Gods could survive it. As a world destroyer, Scotty mentions that it was meant to wipe out the face of the earth. It took Herc's high defense, a mystic code, and his god hand, multiple divine shields from Scotty using her primordial runes, and she was Lost Belt King, and then several primordial runes that came from Sigurd and Brynhilde that reinforced their defense just to stop it, and they only stopped it for a couple of seconds. Da Vinci also tells us with access to the paper moon, his destruction could have reached outside the Lost Belt. Just the residual damage of him bringing his sword down would have burned everything that was in it. I get it. A lot of people aren't up to speed with Sigurd due to the great barrier that is FGO. But for the people who aren't playing, this dude is a beast. He has the sword Gram, which is literally the demonic counterpart to the sword of selection Caliburn. This can only be equaled by Excalibur, and if that wasn't enough, he reforged it to make it even better than it was before. Give this man his credit. With that said, if we're going by his own merits, he's easily an A rank. If you wanted to give him the extra suitor feats, we'd have to call it an EX. Either way, even at his worst, he's better than your favorite's best. Sad story to tell, I know.